Good afternoon, and welcome to CIO Leadership and Career Development Webinar Series. Today we're going to talk about Confrontation. This is a webinar and tweet chat from HealthsystemCIO. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of HealthsystemCIO, and I will be your moderator today. We are having a simultaneous tweet chat hosted by Kate Gamble, our Managing Editor and Director of Social Media. You can participate in a separate browser or on your phone by using the hashtag HSCIOchat, or you can simply view the tweet chat in the Media Viewer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be using the Q&A panel today. You can submit your questions as they occur to you or comments at any time in the Q&A box, and leave the default set to all panelists, and we'll take those later in the program. And you can download the deck by using the URL on your screen. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go about 35 minutes or so with our main panel discussion featuring Chuck Christian, CTO of Franciscan Health, Craig Richardville, SVP and CIO with SCL Health, and Tressa Springman, CIO and SVP of Performance Improvement with LifeBridge Health. So we're going to jump right into what I think will be a fascinating conversation. Let's start off with Chuck. Chuck, can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with these great folks on the phone today. I'm the Vice President of Technology for Franciscan Health, which is a 14-hospital system in Indiana and Illinois. We have about 240-plus locations, which are physician practices, imaging centers, urgent care centers, and hospitals. And my scope responsibility is the technology for the entire enterprise. So that's why I have no hair on my head.
That's a big scope. That covers a lot, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Very good. Craig?
Thanks, Anthony, and also it's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. Craig Richardville, CIO at SCL Health. We are a $3 billion integrated healthcare delivery system based out of Denver, Colorado. We serve three distinct markets. One is what we call the Front Range, which is basically the greater Denver area. One we call the Western Slope, which is on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, and we service that area of Colorado and eastern Utah. And then we also have services up in the state of Montana, where we cover the whole state. Been here for about 5 months, going through a lot of fun changes. The organization is really positioned well to move forward in a lot of the digital aspects of healthcare, and I'm very excited to be here. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. Tressa?
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tressa Springman. As Anthony mentioned, I'm the CIO, and actually at this point I'm over the HIM function for LifeBridge Health, which is a $2.2 billion in revenue integrated delivery network in the Baltimore and broader Maryland area. I've been there for 7 years. Have had a fantastic journey. Maryland is a waivered state, the only one from that's waivered under Medicare. So we are playing the total cost of care game, and the majority of our work, revenue, and focus is on the outpatient side. And thanks for having me. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation.
I think so. Thank you, Tressa. Appreciate you being here. Okay, I thought it might be helpful to start with a definition of what we're going to talk about and to get people's thoughts on it. So for the purposes of our discussion, I define it as confrontation is the initiation of a formal conversation with a coworker, usually but not necessarily someone who reports to you, during which you will deliver information, news, or feedback that you have reason to believe will not be well received. So this is not the positive, you've been doing great talk. Tressa, does that definition work for you for sort of framing what we're going to talk about today?
So, yeah, it absolutely does, Anthony. You know, I'm a voracious reader, and I suspect many people in the audience have read the books by Patterson and Grenny, you know, Crucial Conversations and Crucial Confrontation. And I think, unfortunately, the connotation of confrontation is super negative. And I like your comment about the delivery of bad news. Usually it has to do with a tough discussion about why something didn't go the way it should have, or a broken trust, or a perceived lack of accountability in a commitment that was made. So they're really tough conversations. And, I like your definition. For me, I think they're important and they're healthy. And it's a bit of a shame it has such a negative connotation because they're so important. Right.
Very good. Chuck?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little sterile, but I think it's kind of a clinical definition. I think it's right on target. The one thing that that I've always kind of lived by and trying to the people that have worked for me that I try to develop is remind them that any behavior that they allow, they're basically condoning. And so if you do not take the opportunity to have a conversation or confrontation, the conversations don't necessarily have to be confrontational. There are ways of addressing and delivering not so pleasant news that can be viewed, if you're good at it, you can be viewed as coaching, mentoring, or, providing information that will assist them in either their current or their next careers.
Yeah, maybe to put a little more color around it, make it less sterile, is to say that, I assume that it may not be received positively. And I think that's important. So you talk to someone, you may put in every effort to have it go over well. Some people are just not going to take it well. So and I think we're kind of looking at how to get people to take it well, but then how to deal with it when they don't. So Craig, let me go to you and get your thoughts on the definition and your thoughts on what Chuck Atressa has said.
Yeah. So I think it's a great foundation, a good place to start. The one thing I've always looked at myself as I've kind of become more seasoned throughout my career is really to become more of a professional parent or a professional father. And I think when you have a confrontation type of a discussion, you can take that into your personal life or take your personal life and bring that into the professional world. So, for example, if you have children who aren't pulling the grades that you thought, aren't given the performance that you thought that they should be having, or there's a certain behavior and attitude as they're going through their teenage years or other aspects, you've got to sit down and talk to that child and have those kinds of conversations. And I think the same thing relates back to the personal. I mean, part of this is learnings and to help that person, kind of realize their actions or behaviors are just not acceptable in the environment that you were expecting, and to have those conversations to help them, be more of a better member of that group or society, or in this case, in your work life.
Yeah, and we'll get into more as we go on about what happens when that doesn't have the effect you'd hoped for, because I think that's where things get, super interesting in terms of how to deal with it. So very good for that. Craig, let's stick with you here. I would contend that most people hate confrontation. I think that's just natural. I think most people don't like it. I'm guessing that successful leaders do not have this quality. And do you agree? How do you feel about having to initiate a confrontational meeting? Does it bother you? Do you stress over it? Is it unpleasant? Or you say, hey, it's just part of the gig. It's what I got to do.
Absolutely. I think it's to your prior comment. I mean, leaders are people, and we all have a big heart, and we all have care and compassion. And so when you have to have those kinds of conversations, at least for me, it is a stressful environment to go through and make sure that you are delivering the message as succinct as possible to help that individual. But, having separated a couple of individuals within the organization, sat down and talked to one of the other senior leaders, and it was like, if you didn't care and didn't feel bad that happened, you probably don't have a heart. So the fact that you actually do care to have those conversations, and it is impactful upon you, I think, kind of relates back to successful leaders probably have even a larger heart and more caring than possibly others.
That's an interesting point. So, and I think that's a good message for people on the line. It doesn't mean that you're not a good leader if it bothers you to do this. It actually means you may be a better leader because it should bother you. Is that your point, Craig?
That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. Tressa, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it takes a lot of preparation. It is usually, based on my own experience, if you want to get the appropriate outcome without degrading the relationship or kind of trying to refocus and create safety so that you're focused on solving the problem and not attacking the person, you can't be cavalier about it. For me, when I know I need to have one of these conversations, I spend a lot of time in preparing, really challenging myself on what I want the outcome to be, how to make sure that I don't get too emotionally engaged in the conversation itself so that my own emotion overtakes a good outcome, and creating a safe space. I mean, it's easy for it to go south really quickly when the person with whom you're engaging, is either resistive or just not the type that takes feedback well.
That's a great point about the emotion, because you can imagine in any number of these situations, you're annoyed, you're irritated, you may even be angry, which is spurring this meeting. But you got to pull all that out of it. Otherwise, it's not going to go well. Right, Tressa?
Well, for me, I know it won't go well because I could get myself very emotionally engaged, and I think that takes you off the course of the outcome. For me, it's not about punishing or proving a point. It's about trying to create that safe space to understand how did this go off the rails, and is it a skill that you're not armed with, or are you just kind of from an attitude and a mental perspective not wanting to engage here? And I think those are two very different types of problems.
Yeah, they are. That's a great point, and certainly the latter, when either the will or the caring, the focus isn't there. That's a bigger problem, right? Because it's not that I can give you a skill. It's that you just didn't take this seriously enough, or you didn't focus on this enough. Chuck?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with everything that Tressa and Craig said. The one thing I had to learn a long time ago was, you're dealing with a behavior, without attacking the person. Because if it gets down to a personal level, it's not okay to say, well, what were you thinking? You need to be very succinct and very prepared about the messages you want to deliver about the behavior. I've had to deliver these kinds of conversations with friends of mine that actually I trained and eventually had to separate them from the organization. Not really what I wanted to do, but it was something that was the best for the organization, and in the end was the best for the other individual as well. So you have to take a measured approach at this. If you are angry, take a beat. Don't engage, because if you do, the outcome that you're looking for is not going to happen. You may be coming across in your anger rather than as the leader that you need to be in these situations. The other thing that you have to be careful of is engaging in that kind of conversation based upon less than good, accurate facts around whatever it is you're having conversation. Dealing with third-hand information and having a critical conversation about it is not a really good approach. You need to make sure that you've done your homework and you've gathered up the details and you have the facts based upon either your own observations or from documented sources of information that you need to have because if it gets to the point that you have to separate that person from the organization, or you have to put them on a process improvement program, you're going to have to involve HR, and HR is going to need that documentation to back up those conversations and any other initiations that may take place. And sometimes you may have to have somebody else in the room with you while you're having those conversations. So it's not around he said, she said. It's around what was actually said. And then the one thing I've always done too is after the conversation took place, I document what the conversation was based upon my best recollections.
Yeah, and we're going to get to more of that, but that's all great points. So I've heard from a number of you about it sounds like you get your emotions under control, so there could be a time delay that needs to happen, meaning you got to calm down. And so let's not have this meeting today, let's have it in 2 days or whatever. And the preparation and having your facts in order and doing your research. And then the word succinct was used a couple times. So it sounds like these could have a tendency to sort of scope creep in a meeting. It's almost like when you have a fight with your spouse and they're bringing up things from 10 years ago. So you want to make sure you don't scope creep, it sounds like. So that was just a little review of what I've heard so far. But let's go to the next question. And Chuck, let's stick with you here. Do you have any recollections of confrontational meetings in your career during which you were the one being confronted and that resulted in becoming a better employee? I put in this question because this actually happened to me when I was a young person, and I was probably not doing the best work I could. I wasn't as focused as I should be. And one of my managers took me in the office and had a talk with me, and it actually really had a positive impact on my trajectory. So, Chuck, anything like that come to mind?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's anybody that has had a long career that hasn't had that opportunity. If they haven't, then they've been working for some of the wrong people, because right. I started my career as in radiology as a rad tech, and I was one of the young guys, and I wound up supervising folks that had trained me early on in my career, and I had a chief tech who was kind of like old chief techs. He's a little burly around the edges, and I had a situation with one of the radiologists that wasn't going well from a relationship standpoint, and so I had an opportunity to have a conversation with the chief tech about what he saw that I was doing wrong, how I was handling that relationship inappropriately, and how that if I didn't modify my behaviors and address it differently, it very well could be a career limiting situation. So he was a good friend, still is until he passed away. And so having those opportunities. And the other one, it wasn't a career. My dad was a Marine, and he had an opportunity, and I made a mistake when I was a junior in high school. I cut school for 20 days in a row.
Whoa.
And so that was, it was a stupid thing. I will absolutely admit it. And then my father taught me a lesson that I never forgot with that, and it was about not punishment, but about disappointment. And so that's the other thing that we have to learn, is that if we're the subject of those conversations and the people that you're working with care about you, then you have you've done more damage than just missed the target on something. You've damaged a relationship that will take some time to repair.
Yep, very good, Craig.
Yeah, I'll go back to several years ago. So very early on in my career, and I think some of us, if not many of us, have had the situation where, part of you kind of developing your sphere of influence was to kind of build your empire, more of a command and control, and give me more responsibility, give me more staff, give me more divisions, departments, whatever. And you kind of started building yourself to be impactful based upon the volume that you were able to direct. And then one of my executives at the time came in to tell me to say, when you're coming into meetings, people know about the scope of responsibility, and you're looking to continue to grow. However, really the key success of being a strong leader is to be able to have that kind of influence and command, but without having them be part of your division or report to you. Mm-hmm. We kind of started terming that the work between the white spaces. And so as I kept maturing within my career, part of my goal was to continue to grow and develop people, departments, divisions, and move things away and not ask and have a responsibility reporting back up into me, but be able to be a leader within the organization that crossed all the different divisions, not just that I had direct responsibility for. So when he sat down and kind of talked to me about how I should mature my career and position myself to be influential without having the command and control, that was a big moment for me, because I was always adding up FTEs, adding up budgets, mm-hmm. and that really is the wrong way to lead. And to move it the other way, to say I am actually going to be leading things that I really don't have control over, but the fact that I'm leading it and that people want to follow and be part of the initiatives that we're working on is really quite complementary versus the reverse.
Very good. Excellent. Tressa?
You know, you've just heard from two gentlemen who are fantastic examples of great leadership. And I think the difference is that was a teachable moment for them. And instead of shutting down in this, quote, conversation of confrontation, they opened up, mm-hmm. and they listened, and they were self-aware, and they applied because they wanted to learn and gain and grow. And, you know, I think that's the essence of these conversations. You know, creating an environment for the conversation where you're giving that other person enough clarity about what's going on that you're putting the choice in their hands. And, you know, similar to these kind of pivotal moments in their career or their life, I think all of us have had those circumstances, and it's what we do with it. And, you know, you've had an effective confrontation if the person is very clear with whom you're speaking on what their next choice is. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones empowered to either lean into it and do something about it, as you've heard from Craig and Christian, or just shut down and say, you know, I'm not taking it, not interested, moving on.
Yeah. Yep. Very good. Very good. All right. Next question. Craig, let's go with you. And there's a number of questions here, so you can sort of jump in where you want. But how do you decide when it's time to have a confrontation? Is it a last resort step? What are the steps you take beforehand to remedy the situation? Do you give some situations time to see if they resolve themselves, which is, you know, putting your head in the sand, but sometimes that's very effective. You know, to jump into everything, I don't think is a good strategy either. Sometimes things work themselves out. Do you employ others to have the confrontational meeting? In some cases, and let's talk about that when it's not just because you don't feel like doing it, but when you think for whatever reason it's going to be more effective. And then some you have to get in, you know, so this is me. Sometimes you have to get in saying, this is my job. I can't put this on anyone. So, Craig, just jump in there where you want.
Sure. Yeah, I'll bounce in on a couple of those. So a lot of great questions, a lot of information, and I'm sure my colleagues have a lot more to share than I do. But when you look at the confrontation, this is the last resort step. For me, it's absolutely not. I mean, a lot of the confrontations that you do have are really just giving that ability to allow somebody to change and to learn and to be have different behaviors or different performance coming out of it. They don't always have to be about separation, but about growth and development and be able to observe and share with them what you feel, you know, needs to change in order to have them be more effective moving forward. And that's part of, obviously, the steps I want to take before you try to remedy the situation. But if you look at how to bring somebody into the meeting, and I think Chuck commented on this earlier, I think it depends on the purpose of the meeting. So if the meeting is, in my opinion, a separation, then yes, I absolutely have human resources become involved and engaged. And I'm there really for kind of something very short and sweet. and be able to move on to allow HR to help them understand the formal policies and the practices of how we would move through that. If it's about growth and development, that can be one-on-one, or if it's with another individual, or if it's with their supervisor, then have them be there so that it's a learning moment for them as well to be part of that education and to move forward with making that person a better employee, associate, and have them have the ability to contribute more in a different way. And the last thing I guess I'll say, and I'll give the other two some time to talk about this, is in many cases, it really is about awareness and about to make sure that, people do understand that this might be the last step before something more, or you've observed that in a meeting that something could have been handled a little bit differently, and next time take that offline. Don't do it in front of 10 or 12 people, because you're going to have a lot of different interpretations of that. So those are just some thoughts on your questions.
Excellent. Very good. Tressa?
Yeah, I think Craig handled kind of the penultimate crucial conversation when there's a separation. So I'll readdress a circumstance where we've just had perhaps some broken commitments or promises. And, I always start with myself, and I reflect quite a bit on, did I help create part of the problem? Was I not clear in expectation setting? Did I send mixed messages? Was there something about the expectation, the deadline, et cetera? So I start with me and then share my observations. I share my observations with the individual, and I allow them the opportunity to help me reframe what my observations have led me to believe, and why I feel there's kind of a disconnect between what the stated objective is and what the performance level was. So, again, starting with me, explaining my observations, giving them the opportunity to weigh in. I think in terms of having others involved, unless it's very directly an HR call, that's a tough one. That's really a tough one, because when it gets to, and I've mentioned it a couple times, creating safety, in these kind of emotionally charged conversations, if someone's going to really have a vulnerable and direct conversation, usually privacy is pretty important.
You know what? I think my last part of that question was misunderstood, and I have a question later about bringing HR in. What I meant by that last question was to have someone else do the meeting for you, another manager or someone who works with you.
Yeah.
So, like you go meet with this person and see where it goes, tell them, as opposed to you doing it. So that's what I kind of meant by that.
Yeah. No, never. I never do that. That's okay. My job.
Okay. Very good. Chuck?
Well, I think that in one situation, to get to your last question, when those folks are they don't report to me directly, but report to me through another manager. If that manager was also as an observer of the behavior, you have a couple of conversations you can have. Is one with that manager, and wanting to know their thoughts about what did you observe, what did you see, and what do you think that we should be telling that employee, and then if they don't follow through with that conversation, then you have one with your manager. But I agree with the other two. Trying to get someone else to go have the conversation is not a really good approach. It's kind of like getting your buddy to go ask your girlfriend for a date for yourself.
But that could work. Don't you think that could work sometimes?
Well,
anyway.
It only works in operas. It doesn't work in real life.
Oh, okay.
And so, the thing about it is, and it says more about you as a manager and your willingness, because like you said in the beginning, I don't think anybody really likes confrontation. However, I have worked for a couple of people that I think they actually loved it. Because they were so confrontational all the time, that they really did enjoy it.
And that's not a positive thing, you're saying?
No, absolutely not. But it was a learning opportunity for me, and I think that's the thing for me is that in these situations you have to figure out how to do two things. One is if you're the manager or you're the leader who is confronting, there's something for you to learn about the situation, about the person that's sitting in front of you, and that person also has something to learn about either the missed goal, promise, opportunity, or behavior that needs to be addressed. And that's the thing that you need to focus on: is what is it that we're both needing to get out of this? Because the other thing is that I always give the person the opportunity to tell me what you're thinking. It's not the old psychology joke about, well, how does that make you feel? It's about really trying to connect with that individual and build a deeper relationship to understand why that behavior or why the thing you're having a conversation about occurred.
Very good. All right, Chuck, I'm going to stick with you here. What is your methodology or style for dealing with the actual confrontation? Is there a flow to these meetings? Do you have sort of an opening, a main, and a closing to kind of leave everything good? Do you think it out that much? How do you conduct a confrontational meeting so as to create the greatest chance of achieving a positive outcome? It's interesting, they're not going anywhere at the moment, unless, again, it's a separation. And sometimes, which I wanted to mention, is sometimes you're having meetings not knowing which direction things are going to go in, right? So depending on the outcome of this meeting, we could either move towards separation or we could, bring you back into the fold, depending on your behavior after the meeting. So what's your style and the other issues brought up here?
Well, if I could tell you that, I could pick the 6 numbers, and we wouldn't be having this conversation for the Powerball this week. The thing about it is, I've been through, just like the other folks on the panel, been through all kinds of management education. I've been told to, lead off with something good, make it a sandwich, talk about the behavior in the middle, then end with something that's really good and positive about that individual. And, I think that, to me, that may work in some situations, but not in all. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's better just to pull the Band-Aid off all in one fell swoop and say, okay, and most of the time, people know why they're being called into the office, and the door gets shut. They know they're going to get news that you don't want to deliver amongst the masses. Right. The rule is always to praise in public, but to coach in private. I was going to say criticize, but coach is actually a better term. Mm-hmm. And so, and the other thing too is it depends upon the situation. I mean, it depends upon how egregious the event was. I had the pleasure. I shouldn't say it's pleasure. I had the opportunity I witnessed a coworker of mine that was my peer years ago, before sexual harassment was a thing. This was like 20-something years ago, but his behavior was inappropriate, and so I took it upon myself, and he and I had a conversation about his behavior, and I let him know that I have daughters, and if that had been one of my daughters, you've been picking yourself up off the floor. Oh, not necessarily in so many words, but letting him know that his behavior was very inappropriate, and what he said was not appropriate, and if he might expect a visit from HR. So you have to kind of I think you have to kind of gauge what the situation is, and I don't think there's a perfect formula. I think there are techniques that you can use to release some of the pressure and tension of having those crucial conversations. But I've never found a perfect formula for doing it.
Very good, Craig.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of the things that Chuck mentioned. A couple of things I would clarify on is, one is I actually do typically start out with something that is in a positive state. You're a good person. You did well on this. Just like when, again, going back to the professional father, when I have to talk to my children on tough subjects, first to kind of start out with, clearly understand that I love you. Okay, now let's get into the discussion. I think that's important to level set, at least for me, to make sure that the person knows that they are being treated as a person, as a human being, and not just as an asset. And then the other thing is to be very clear. I think this is something for me is sometimes you can continue to belabor and kind of beat around outside of it. But I think you have to be very clear on the performance or the behavior or whatever it is that is not acceptable. And very similar to the third point, be very clear on what the outcome is or what the outcome would be. This is not a negotiable type discussion. It is not a discussion. This is not for you to try to defend the different things that were happening or that did happen. It really, and for me, it's like 5 minutes or less. It's very something that I would rather have them to have the time to ponder and think about what I said and remember exactly what I said in the communication versus any subject to any other type of interpretation. And we talked for an hour, and I'm trying to pull out the golden nuggets from that conversation. No, it's very short, distinct, very clear, and then give that person some time to to kind of ponder on the conversation.
Yep. Tressa?
Yeah, I agree. I probably put much more time into preparing what I want out of the conversation and for the conversation than how long an effective conversation takes place. I think being very tight and very clear and allowing for some conversation and listening, but only within the context of really validating what the intent of that discussion is. I think folks who aren't typically comfortable with confrontation, they talk and talk and talk, and you're trying to figure out. You're like, God, I know there must be something really uncomfortable you don't want to share with me, but it's somewhere in like all that you just put there on the table. And people who know me, they know I'm really direct. And when I'm seeking feedback, even for self-improvement, it's like, what did you just say? Because I really want to learn from this. And so I think tight, appropriate, direct. I love what Craig said about the non-negotiability. Let me just set the stage. This is not a negotiation, an argument. He said, she said, frankly, organizationally, I'm the leader. I've got the choice. I've got the decision-making capability. That doesn't mean the door's shut for conversation, but let's just be really clear on the intent here.
This is very interesting. Very interesting. A lot of comments about preparation, having the facts, and then making it, short and sweet, so to speak. But there's a little bit of wiggle room I'm hearing for hearing from the other person, and then there is no wiggle room. So I'm kind of a little bit unclear on how much.
Well, Anthony, let me clarify a little bit for me, at least for me, and that is maybe when I was a line manager, I had a lot more visibility and interaction on a day-to-day basis with the team that worked for me. With the span of control that I now have, my data points can be from various corners of the organization and over time. So, to the comment that Chuck made about what exactly is the behavior we're talking about, I mean, if it's egregious and it's direct, honestly, that's easy stuff. It's harder, but again, what we allow, we condone. It's harder when you get this sense with some symptoms that there's a problem, and yet that if you don't at least put it on the table now, that 2 months from now you could just have a raging problem on your hands. So to me, it's about really floating out the observation, depending on the circumstance, just to make sure that there isn't something I'm missing. And, frankly, 9 times out of 10, I haven't missed anything, and they've confirmed my suspicions, and I just continue down that path of what the next action steps are going to be. But for me, that's why I think there needs to be wiggle room. Really, really great leaders, if all we act on are assumptions, then we aren't giving people necessarily the benefit of the doubt or the opportunity to explain a very real reason which something may have gone off the rails.
So, Craig,
I think Tressa's touched on a really important point, which maybe we didn't distinguish in some of our conversations. And I think that is, if it is something that you observed or you were initially part of, I think the short, distinct, this is not a discussion, not negotiable, because I'm not hearing somebody else's interpretation of an event versus possibly something that happened somewhere else. You heard it from somebody, you heard it from 3 or 4 sources, you validated those sources, and then you went back. You may at that point allow a little bit of, in my opinion, a little bit of discussion. However, you're not really going, for me at least, not really talking about that specific event and all the things that surround it, but that action that you did or the lack of performance that happened or that behavior, regardless of the situation, isn't acceptable. And this is the outcomes from that. So regardless of everything around it. However, if you didn't personally observe it, or you may allow a little bit more of an interpretation from their part.
Chuck, any more thoughts on that distinction?
No, sir. I think they nailed it right on the head.
All right, very good. I have an audience question in that I want to get to before we continue. And to remind people, if you do have a question, send it in. Here's the question. Any input on coordinating a crucial conversation between different levels within the organization? For instance, a physician versus a therapist at odds over rehab care of a patient. Tressa?
God. I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that one.
Oh, no.
That really, in my mind, gets to, as leaders, the ability to less from a confrontational perspective and more from a facilitation perspective. In that specific circumstance, my immediate reaction is to get people together and remind them that we all have the shared goal about the patient. Let's start, and it's somewhat like Craig said about with your children, with others. You start with a positive, and you say, "Look, we're all here with a shared goal or purpose, no matter what it is." And with that circumstance, it's to do the right thing by the patient. And if you start with what you can agree on, and work through what's the least common denominator here between the two of us, and make sure that you can advance that conversation without anybody getting so emotionally involved that they start attacking the people versus the problem, I think you've done well. That, to me, though, is much more the role of we as leaders being an effective facilitator.
Very good. Chuck?
Yeah, I absolutely would agree. And the other thing you have to be cautious of is to make sure that rather than helping solve the problem, you wind up with 2 people that don't like you because they have they have something. They now you have given them the opportunity to have something in common.
Right.
But yeah, I do agree. I said that that's part of our jobs as leaders to help facilitate those conversations when 2 people will not. Whether it's between a physician and one of the service line organizations, or between 2 people on your staff. I've had that situation, and putting those folks in a room together and having a critical conversation with both of them at the same time to get an understanding of what's really going on, and typically it usually winds up being a misunderstanding. That you can get through, but you as a leader have to be clear is that you're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior, and it needs to be fixed. You can help facilitate the fixing of it, but it's really going to be between those 2 individuals to either work it out or take a different approach.
Craig?
Yeah, I think they hit it. Hit the nail on the head with a couple. The only thing I would add is, first, Chuck always kind of puts a smile on your face with his comments. So thanks for always keeping good humor as part of the conversation. But in this specific example, I think it's important, and as Tressa talked about as being the facilitator, you're the one that's kind of coordinating the event. However, it's important for me that the physician takes his stripes off and that that these are two professionals sitting together, or three or four, whatever the numbers are. But I think when you're having these types of discussions, this is not a power thing. This is not I'm higher than you. It's really got a level set. I think everybody, to Tressa's point about you have a common purpose regardless of your role. This is exactly what we're kind of shooting towards. As a matter of fact, in many cases, it's very more complementary if people can step out of their role and actually put themselves in the other person's shoes, or maybe in a third party's shoes, or maybe in this case in the patient's shoes, and really look at it from a different set of lens than what they currently have in their role. So for me, I think taking the stripes off is really important so that everybody feels free and safe to participate in the conversation.
Very good. All right. This is my favorite part of our webinars, Ask a Cult Panelist. So, Chuck, let's start with you. Do you have a question for one or both of your Cult Panelists?
This is always a dangerous part of your webinars, is asking questions. I mean, I really don't. I have high respect and regard for these two folks that are on the panel with me today, and I think that one of the reasons, Anthony, you said when this idea popped in your head, and we need to talk about that too, is that you thought of the three of us, and we're all wondering why. But the thing about it is, and I think that you've heard some great examples of how to effectively have those critical conversations. So I'd ask either of my two co-panelists if there was ever a situation where the conversation didn't go as exactly as they had planned.
Tressa, why don't you start out?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, I think early on in my career, and I spoke to it earlier, I'd get really caught up in the emotion of my own emotion. And I learned really quickly that was just bad. It didn't help me. It didn't help them. It didn't help the circumstance. But also, and I can't cite the example, but one reason that I am very open to the fact that I may not be reading the tea leaves right is I don't chew on things a long time. I like to take that more nip-in-the-bud approach, which means that sometimes I am jumping the gun and I don't know the whole story. So I have learned in being perhaps not allowing the other person to kind of explain the why or speak to what the barriers of success have been, that in fact in other circumstances I was the barrier myself. And so, I think it comes down to what kind of information do you have about the circumstance. So, it's gone badly enough to hope that now I am better for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I had actually it brings a smile back to my face. So I had a situation where somebody who was a very high performer, but had some behavioral and some cultural issues of fitting into the organization. And it worked for one of my vice presidents. So at the time, I took it upon myself to say, let's have that be a direct report, and I can work very close with that person over the next year, and thought in my own mind that I'd be able to help that person learn and be continue to contribute, but also be a very well-respected and accepted member of the whole management team. About a year later, that did not work. I did not have that ability. So we sat down and to have the conversation that this just wasn't going well. But even though you have a tremendous record of success, the fact that of how you behaved and talked to some other people was just not going to work for us anymore. So I sat down to have that hard conversation, had human resources with me to go through the policies. And again, my conversations are 3 to 5 minutes. I'm done and I'm out. And about halfway through, she said, I was waiting for this to happen. I can't wait, and it was like, oh, I've never had it so easy. I said, well, I guess you kind of summed it up for me. And I walked out, and that was the end of it. And she moved on to another career. But it was something that was very surprising to me, but it also kind of reinforced the behavior of that person, and how that person interpreted and did things was totally different than how most of us would like to have been treated. So.
Very good. All right. Tressa, you have a question for your co-panelists?
I do. And considering that you are one of them,
oh boy,
why did you pick the three of us?
Good question.
I came up with the topic because I find it interesting very much, the idea of confrontation, all the nuances and subtleties of how to do it, and how to deal with it, and how to try to get a positive outcome. And then I thought, what folks do I thought, what folks do I know that I could picture not shying away from tough conversations? Let's put it that way. And I thought of the three of you, and there you go. And I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I appreciate your honesty. I don't know if that was a compliment or an insult, but I appreciate your honesty.
It is a compliment. It is nobody's going to mess with you three. You're not going to get pushed around. And I think that was where I was coming from. So
thank you.
Come on, Anthony. You know that I'm easy.
No, Chuck. I think when you told me you were telling me stories at HIMSS one time. I don't know if you told me one of your managers or bosses had asked you to deal with a problem. It might have been around telecommunications and something that wasn't getting good cell service in a part of the building, and they referred to you as their bulldog. Is that correct, or am I making that up?
Well,
go get them. I need this problem solved.
Maybe Chihuahua, not necessarily bulldog.
Very good.
And we got it fixed, but it took some crucial conversations to get that taken care of. Yeah.
Crucial conversations. Very good. All right, Craig, a question for either of your co-panelists.
Yeah, actually, I'll fire one over toward Tressa. So I'm a big fan, as many, if not all of us are, of diversity and inclusion and all the different aspects, and women leaders, especially in technology, is very exciting and a trend that continues to accelerate. I was just curious as to, has your gender at all impacted anybody's interpretation or anybody's discussions with you in any of your confrontational meetings?
Thank you, Craig. I'm actually, I think that it's an interesting topic to navigate, and I've been asked to speak on it on a number of occasions. And I remind especially the women in the room who are coming up through the ranks, is if you want to be a really great leader, reminder, you're going to be leading men too. And at the end of the day, you need to identify what kind of a leader you want to be seen as. And I happen to be a mother of all men. So I see what the pendulum swinging has created in terms of not necessarily just giving the best person the job, but really having to take into account how we level the playing field. So, but it's interesting you said that, because when Anthony was talking about situations of a confrontational specific situation we had, if you didn't notice, I totally sidestepped it. But now I'll come back to it, because probably one of the most important and pivotal conversations in my career was when I was a brand new CIO and I worked for a super old school CFO from Jersey. And he asked me if I had a gender problem, because he straight up said to me, you've got so many important points to get across and you shy away from it at every opportunity. And that's not what I'm paying you to do. And he's like, you're not going to hide behind the girl thing. So, I think a lot of we women now in this space, we need to make it safe. We need to make it safe for everybody that we serve to be very comfortable and to try and take gender bias to the extent that we can out of the conversation. And yet a lot of my peers, a lot of women in this space recognize that the numbers still suggest that there's tremendous inequity and bias. So, like everything else, it's a journey, and I think that we've come a long way. I think we have a lot further to go, and I think we need to be really mindful of having that pendulum swing too far out of balance. Because at the end of the day, and I know the both of you would agree, we're leaders. You know, we're leaders, and we need to lead all kinds of people, whether it's race, gender, diversity, because it's really inspiring them to follow us, not to drag them along. And the only way to do that is to really be able to appeal to who they are as people, no matter who they are.
One more audience question. Going to give everybody about 20 seconds to respond, and then I'll let you go. If there is a disagreement among coworkers on your team, do you normally start by encouraging them to work it out first, or do you step in and clarify expectations before things escalate? Chuck?
Well, once again, I'll give you a good Six Sigma answer. It depends and of who it is, and if they're at the same level, trying to get them to work it out without your intervention is kind of like I use Craig's example is your kids. I have 4 daughters. There was never any drama in my house. And so getting the kids to work it out among themselves without that parental intervention is the best possible thing. But in many cases, like I've mentioned before, I've had to do that on several occasions, and you do wind up being that convener. And sometimes I felt like I was Henry Kissinger. But you have to give them the opportunity, because you can't you may have to step in and make a decision, but for the most part allowing them to come up with a solution is really a better approach for me anyway.
Tressa?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I think for me, I let them know that I'm very aware that there's a problem and that I have an high expectation that there's sufficient professionals to work it out. Having said that, it does depend. If it's a very emotional topic, or if it's something that has to do with non-work related, maybe it's cultural, or there's some other influences there. I think you just need to use your own intuition on what level of involvement to take.
Craig?
Yep, 100% agree. The first and foremost, they need to try to work it out, and the only way that I would get, and that's part of their growth and maturity, would be to, if one of them came to me, maybe offer some advice or some ways to open the conversation with the other individual. But I should be more or less the last resort, that they have tried that, they've worked it, and then I will come in and have a teachable moment. But hopefully they can work it out, and 9 times out of 10 people do that. And I assume a lot of that happens even without even coming to me, because they've been able to learn how to work it out. Yeah.
Right. And it certainly doesn't speak well for the individuals involved if they can't, right? Especially if they're equal level. It's like, come on, you got to bring me into this? I got other things to do. All right. Well, thank you. So it was such a great conversation and a fun time, and I appreciate it. Regarding continuing education, those of you who hold the CHIME CHCIO certification get 1 CEU for attending our events. So let CHIME know you were here, and if you've asked us to do so, we will. If you need a certificate of attendance for another CEU program, you can use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when our on-demand recording of this event has been posted to our YouTube channel. If you want to sponsor one of our upcoming events or book a custom event, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox, and you can go to our website to register for our upcoming webinars. So with that, I want to thank Chuck Christian, Craig Richardville, and Tressa Springman, and I want to thank you, our attendees. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.